Hello, my name is Justin Perkins, and welcome to Talk Junkie. This is going to be a multi-part podcast, quite a few parts probably. Maybe not right in order. I don't know how I'm going to break this up because there's a lot to cover. But one of my favorite things in the world is music. Ever since I was younger, I've always been just in love with music. And I've already done some podcasts involving music. I really loved doing the Music and Memories podcast, which I'm going to do other parts to that. I mean, there was stuff that, I'd forgotten that I wanted to even talk about because I don't always take show notes. I did take show notes for this one just because my memory's not that great and there was a lot of stuff to kind of get into. But music, I think, is an integral part of a lot of people's lives, and I think it really means a lot to a lot of different people. A lot of people remember, their favorite band, when they got acquainted with that band or a certain song, or they remember, they have memories associated with music. A lot of people, have songs that remind them of their significant other, things of that nature. I think for a lot of us, it's because music is so important, and how we get that music and how we acquire that music and what we use to take it in is kind of indicative of our age and what point of history we were raised in, and it's just a sign of the times. And this is going to be a long bunch of podcasts that kind of cover that very topic, and it's over. It's two different podcasts, which will have multiple episodes to each podcast. The first podcast is going to be centered around musical formats, and looking at everything from records to 8-tracks to tapes to CD to digital music, and how we consume those things and where they came into our life. So the first podcast and its multiple episodes will look at music formats and how we get them, and then the second podcast will look at kind of a subset off that, radio, MTV, and YouTube. How we kind of got music that we didn't purchase, free music, and how it come to us, and it'll be broke down into multiple episodes. But this episode, we're going to start with formats, and I'm going to try to cover as many of them as I can in each episode, because some of them are going to be short, some of them are going to be long. But we're going to start off with records. The record was actually invented in 1877, and you're looking at small recordings, very short recordings, some of which I think, between the phonograph and telegraph and all these different machines, they may have had a hard time getting it to reproduce sound, because we had advanced so far past the technology. I think some of those earliest records that we have, they were late 90s, early 2000s, getting reproducing the sound and even really looking into them, taking the time to look into them, see what was on them, and they were quick little bursts of sound, nothing huge, and it got up to around the late 1800s into the 1900s, some 3-minute recordings and things of that nature, all the way up to 10 and 12 inch records, all the way up to the 78s and the 45s, that become prevalent. Vinyl is an interesting one because you kind of have to talk about vinyl in two different sections. I'm not really, in my opinion, old enough to be a part of the original vinyl generation. I was born in 82, which in the early 80s, vinyl was, huge. In the early 80s, vinyls had about 2 billion in sales, in the first part of that decade. And, you look at that time frame and just for inflation and availability and all those things, that's a good chunk of change, and obviously it's a very popular it is a very popular format, and even though I'm too young to have appreciated it then, I come to appreciate it later on in life. But records, really helped jumpstart the music industry into a different direction. Music was based on live performance, solely, and you didn't really have stars in the way that we have stars now, music, or even ways you didn't have stars in the way that they had stars in the 50s. You didn't have Presley and Buddy Holly and Big Bopper and people of that nature. You didn't have a star on that level. Before the advent of radio play and records, music was simply enjoyed live, and the amount, pop music itself was basically non-existent, and the ability to get one artist and let that artist be very unique and specific to their own music, write their own music, and have them be able to get that music to the masses was hard. You had music that had been composed, music the likes of Beethoven and things of that nature that could be shared via sheet music and had been a part of education with more, in more affluent societies. The arts were often treasured and taught in these affluent families. Something that we don't really put as much of a value on anymore are the arts, but it seems like they truly valued them. But that's how music was kind of shared, and even with early American songwriters and composers, their music was shared via sheet music and other musicians playing it, because simply there was no way to travel and really you couldn't tour. There wasn't touring on that level. You could travel the country and play music, but in order for things to work the way they do now, if someone gets famous now, they get radio play, which is not as big as it used to be, but they get a YouTube video, they get on iTunes, they get those things. Well, one, it's readily available, and you can share the music in an instant, and everybody can hear the same version from the same person. That's very unique to this time, because before the recording industry and before radio, that wasn't truly possible. But also the ability to be connected to everyone and look at what everyone's listening to, look at what everyone's being exposed to, and being able to share that as a community. That is something that would be completely unheard of. At the best, you could get a magazine or a news article write-up in the early days, but a write-up of what? Of someone playing the piano and playing their song in a small intimate setting somewhere. Again, it's very hard outside of what was even then considered the masters of classical music. Again, Bach, Chopin, Beethoven, gentlemen of that nature, who had long since passed, or some had passed. Their music was being shared via people who had the ability to play the instrument and the ability to read the sheet music, and the sheet music is what they had handed down. So the original format for music really was sheet music. That's the original format for music, is sheet music. And even though the record comes along in 1877, it has no ability to replace sheet music. It also has no ability to have an impact on the music industry. But as you move in, to the 50s, 40s, 30s, starting from bluegrass music and church music and things of that nature, it became possible for people to go record an album, it's hard to come down with a solid price and doing research and stuff for these things. Wikipedia is where you're at, and what that was via inflation and how many people were doing it. But just the sheer amount of records out there, older records that have managed to last this long, are a testament to that. There were a lot of records made, and there were a lot of people recording this music. And, it slowly becomes a form of revenue, although not a huge form of revenue. But the purpose in the record in the beginning of the music industry is not necessarily the sale of the record, but of radio play. See, radio, especially before TV comes in, is by far the dominant format. And radio with music continues to be the dominant format, I would argue, all the way up until the birth of MTV. So records are not brought in as a competition for radio, but records are brought in, obviously, the two radio is there before records, and records are there before radio in a manner of speaking. That is to say, when they first figure out we don't have to bring a live musician into the studio and have them play and broadcast out, we can now take them on this format, this vinyl format, and play this over the airwaves and have a consistent recording. The song will be the same every time, and we can use this really as filler on radio, not necessarily the main purpose of radio in the beginning. It's there as filler when it's introduced, and these two things come up together, and in the radio industry and the vinyl industry really go hand in hand for the next many decades for that reason. Vinyl and having a good record is your way of getting on the radio, and see, that's the way of getting your song out. But by getting on the radio, you have the intent now of using the radio to make a hit record, and to get that song on the radio and get a hit record ensures record sales, and there comes the profitability for the record companies and the artist. And between payola and basically pay to play, these record companies are paying these disc jockeys and these A&R guys, all these guys at these different radio stations. They're paying these programmers to put their songs on, and they're making stars. And that's one of the problems with pop music, and I believe that's really one of the issues in how country music became pop, and how rock became pop. There's a formula, there's a way to appeal to maybe not the masses, but to appeal to the mass of people who actually purchase. And that formula gets followed, and even though that music may not always rise to the top, if it's being paid to the top, then it ends up on the top. So records really open up, and it's 2018, and I still say record sales, and I think a lot of the industry still said that up until a certain point. Now, when records are really at their highest, and this is very, very debatable on numbers sold and things of that nature, because like I said, you get into early 80s, you're looking at $2 billion in sales. That's a huge number, and I think fairly well considered their highest range. I'm assuming the way that's worded, that's yearly. So they are not, they're not maybe hitting those numbers sales-wise as far as financial numbers early on, but the 50s, 60s, and 70s are huge years for records, and records are highly popular. The issue with records are they're not portable, but you have radio. Now, in 67, 68, in that time period, 8-tracks were introduced, but they fairly well have a short life. They're pretty much gone by 75, and I think that's a testament to the record. now audiophiles will sit and talk about the quality of a record and the sound and the sound difference of it compared to digital and the warmth and things of that nature. And you don't get that same discussion with 8-track because it simply doesn't seem to carry it. It's a tape transfer. It's not viewed as being as good a quality. Also, there was a lot of things that kind of led to the downfall of the cassette tape or of the 8-track. And one thing is, you're looking at the 8-track, being really introduced to the market in 67 and 68, but the tape, especially in Europe, was in there by 62, and was on its way up. So on the heels of the 8-track was a better tape format, but records seem to be able to kind of withstand the fury of this new technology and really outshine it and go on. At the end of this series, my plans, and it's hard to find people that are willing to sit down and talk, and that's sad, but it's just a true statement of the world, is to get people together and sit down and discuss formats and things of that nature, and how they feel about particular formats and things. But like I said, I was born too early, really, or too late, I guess, for records. But as I got older, into my pre-teens, because of us owning some pool halls and some things, video games and jukeboxes in particular, I did become intrigued with records. One, because they were free. Two, because I had a record player, and it was the singles, the 45s. And I had access to that, whereas I didn't have the money to always go out and buy tape, and CDs were still not in vogue, at least to me at that time. So records played that part. But now I will occasionally, and it's very seldomly, grab a vinyl, just because I'm trying not to be a hoarder, and I have that ability to do so. I've done it with cassette tape, with VHS. I've done it with a lot of things, but if it's something that I'm particularly interested in or want to hear, I'm starting to build that collection. And I think one of the big appeals I would have to assume with records in the beginning was one of the big appeals I think a lot of people have with physical media and still do, is the presentation, the physical appearance of that that item, and the big cover and the artwork and the smell. New vinyl has that smell. Old vinyl, if I'm in the Goodwill and I'm looking through their vinyl, old vinyl has that smell. So those things play a big role in the attraction of vinyl, but it also plays a big role in the nostalgia of vinyl and the memories that are made from vinyl. So vinyl, 50s, 60s, 70s, huge. And it had a life before that. Coming to the first part of the 80s, and vinyl is massive. Music changes in the 80s, though. Even as MTV comes along, vinyl's still in there, and vinyl sales are really becoming are still really hanging in there. And as MTV comes in now, coming into the 80s, vinyl has competition with cassette tape. And this is more my era, especially when I first got into music. The cassette tape, like I said, was invented in 62, but by the late 70s, it started to get really big. Now, we're in the 80s. Both of these formats, record and cassette tape, make it to the 2000s. By the mid-2000s, vinyl all but died. Yeah, it all but died. In 2001, cassette tapes covered less than 5% of all music. and by the end of 2002, they'd stopped. Almost all the large companies had stopped producing cassette tapes. So, the cassette tape, to me, you really start them early 80s, maybe mid 80s, 83, and they've got to run to about 2002. But here we are, 83, when cassettes are coming up and records are still there, and records are huge. And I'm not a record aficionado. I'm not a big vinyl guy, so we'll put the pin in records, vinyl, and 8-tracks right there. To give you the stats on records, again, you're looking at a form of recording that was in a much more primitive way, first coming up in 1877. And, like I said, in the early 80s, you're looking at 2 billion in sales. We'll come back to vinyl later on down the road, especially in the synopsis of all this, or in the conclusion of all this. But, we'll say this. I think it was 2016, 2017, new vinyl had 35 million in sales. So after it almost died in the 2000s, the early 2000s, by the teens, it's more than rebuilding. By the end of this decade, coming into 2020, it is back to being a viable format, not for mass production and not for huge sales numbers, but when you're going in these stores now, and you're going in Walmart and Sam Goody, or I don't even know if there are any Sam Goodies, to be completely honest, Barnes and Noble and things of that nature, there's some CDs, but there's predominantly records, and there's record stores. If you live in eastern Kentucky, there's a record store in Whitesburg, Kentucky. It's been there for like 5 or 6 years. They're actually functioning as a record store. It's an amazing record store, great place called Roundabout Music. They sell local art and things of that nature. But, they're making it as a record store, and they're a wonderful record store. On Record Store Day, a buddy of mine got me a copy of a Perfect Circle single, and I was tickled to death to have that, because that's the type of things that I'm interested in, But records of all these formats seem to be the format that won't die. They are by far the oldest running format. And like I said, they just keep coming back like they live forever. Now, as we start talking about cassette tapes, I love cassette tapes. And that's indicative of my age, I feel, or at least what I was exposed to. One of my favorite things was getting a new cassette tape, opening it, putting it in the cassette player, hitting play, pulling out the book, and reading the lyrics, reading the liner notes. I love lyrics. If there's lyrics inside of a cassette tape, I love it. Even as I came into the new metal era of the late 90s, I'm still listening to cassette tapes to some degree, because in my vehicle, that's all I have. My vehicle didn't have a CD player at first, so the Life is Peachy album from Korn I had on cassette tape. I had Around the Fur on cassette. But my early years in getting introduced into classic rock and things of that nature all came from either the few records I had or cassette tapes. And a big part of cassette tapes was making your own tape, making mixtapes. Cassette tapes started, in my opinion, what become the digital revolution, because of the community that it got built around it, with sharing and being able to copy and things of that nature. To be able to, hey, I like that song, well, let me make you a copy of it, be able to dub tapes, and being able to record off the radio and record, songs that you couldn't get, things that you couldn't come up with, and making mixtapes for people and putting a personal touch on a set of musical choices that you feel represents something important you need to say to someone. And I think that was the birth of what led us to digital music. Mixtapes to me were not as prevalent, because I don't think I wasn't in my teens by the time that came along, as far as in the late 80s, very early 90s, that was a huge thing, to give a girl a mixtape or something of that nature. That was a big deal. But to me, it was just being able to put my favorite songs from different artists together, hit the road, and have a tape I could listen to, or get a tape from one of my friends that had 4 or 5 songs on there that I didn't have from somebody else, or things of that nature. And they were still kind of expensive. Where I'm from, especially at that time, there was really nowhere to buy music outside of Walmart or something like that. But you're looking 30, 40 minutes to get anywhere. But there was a place in Red Fox called Mary's House of Music, I believe it was. I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is a little privately owned just music store. And, cassette tapes were expensive. Even there, like whatever format is new and in vogue is generally expensive up to the point of digital. But, To go buy a new cassette tape was a big deal, and I didn't always get to do it. So to make that mixtape, or to have a buddy get me something, or to record something off the radio, hook your TV wires. I'd cover this on another episode. Hook your TV wires in the back of your stereo. It made for a super antenna. You could get radio stations way off, because there was no rock stations where I lived, hardly. Nothing that I consider real rock. And then I could make tapes from the radio and have the songs that I want, and try to get really good at starting exactly when the song started, and stopping exactly when the song stopped wasn't that big of a deal, because you could rewind and go from there. But starting exactly when you wanted to start, and not catching the end of a disc jockey saying something or something of that nature was a big deal. Now, something I didn't look into that I would like to, that's somewhat curious, is with record stations, and I'll probably look at this on the radio end of the podcast when I do the radio podcast, is records were so much more suited for radio play. I've been in some old radio stations that have tape decks, I'm assuming for tape singles, but I guess really outside of tape singles, in their short run, that records stayed pretty predominant in these radio stations for a good run of the tape era, because it really seems like tapes never had the chance to completely just destroy records. They did come in, and they were definitely a force, but not a force as big as records ever were, by no means, because the run that records had. And if you look at CDs, CDs invented in 82, were at least acknowledged, and then in the early 90s, they're already replacing tapes. So tapes had a very short run in regards of being the top seller, and being the most, I guess the most dominant format, if they ever were. It was probably pretty stiff competition with them and records. With tapes though, they were very abundant. It was it just seemed to be, I guess, because again of my age and the time I was in, that they were everywhere, and singles were everywhere. I remember my dad, I don't know if he went to an auction, I don't remember where he got it from, but he gets a box, I mean a case, of Biz Markie cassette singles. Little paper sheath that goes over the cassette, and it wasn't the one song, Baby You Got What I Need, or what. It wasn't that song. It was a different song. It was a worse song, if possible. It was a worse song. And there was also a time he come up with a big pack of Bobby Brown cassette singles. I don't know, but I mean, I'm talking 30 or 40. And I remember he gave us a bunch of them. I don't know, maybe 20 cassettes out of one box and 10 or 15 out of the other, and just take them straight home, put a piece of tape over them, over the little hole on the top, and boom, there you go. You make your own tape. So you go from having 30 copies of one song you don't want to listen to being able to make copies of other stuff. And cassettes were huge in the ability to record. I, when I first started playing in a band, we were struggling to try to figure out a way to record all the time, and we would either use a video recorder, like a video camera, or just a cassette recorder, and the quality was horrible. But if you jump to the early 2000s, 2003, 2004 in there, I had a 4-track, and that's how I was recording at that time, with a 4-track cassette recorder, and I would even record my band practice with that, but I would go in and try to mix music with a 4-track, and if I had a 4-track cassette recorder right now, I would be much more comfortable using it. So it's a very versatile, very usable format for music, and I think it was one of my favorites because of my love of music really began with it, and it was so flexible and there, and when I was very young, I had a cassette recorder. I'd sit and I would do little skits and pretend I was doing the news and pretend I was doing a movie and pretend I was doing a radio show and things like that, and I could record it and play back to it. So I think cassette tapes had a very big impact on me because of that, because of it being there in the early part of my life. So, we're coming into cassettes, coming into the early 90s. Here we've started in 1877 with these records, and I really don't consider that the birth of the type of records we look at. And looking at numbers and sales and statistics and things, I'm going to say let's start in the 50s with records. And again, records coming from the 50s to the early 2000s and almost dying, and in probably the early 90s when CDs started to kill out the cassette, that helped kind of put the nail in the coffin for records, and records become very hard to find, and they weren't in stores, and they were in record stores still, but they weren't in mainstream stores, because Walmart at some point jumps into this and becomes a big retailer for music, and unfortunately also gains the ability to force a little control and censorship onto the record industry. But records really being the birth of modern music recording, or of music recording, it's a very important format for music, and it's one that's very cherished. I know a lot of people my age and younger, especially younger, who have really got into to records and vinyl. Like I said, you look at $2 billion in sales in the early 80s to, literally nothing in the mid-2000s. 2005, 2006, nothing. It's dead. Almost everyone had written it off. And then you jump to end of this last decade, coming into 2020, just new vinyl. This is just new vinyl, because you have to look, the amount of old vinyl out there is staggering. So that number is probably much higher, much, and it's impossible to track. But new vinyl sales are 395 million, coming in the end of the teens. So it's made a massive resurgence, especially to be a physical medium. The 8-track coming in the 60s, late 60s, 67, really 68, and being gone by 75. I've been around 8-tracks, I've known, listened to them, had some, very little. Three Dog Night was the one that distinctly sticks out in my mind. Had at a place my dad rented when him and my mom first got divorced. But it doesn't have an impact on me, and I don't know who it does. But it's cool that it was really portable, but it just didn't seem to have any staying power. You jump there to the cassette tape, one of my first loves, and one of the formats that I really first fell in love with and liked so much, and to me a very versatile, very easy, user-friendly, versatile format, especially in what it allowed for mixtapes and things of that nature, because there really was no recording with the records at home. You couldn't do that. You either had to own the record or hear it on the radio, and there was no way to capture it off the radio until you got the cassette. Late 70s, the cassette really started to build steam. In the 80s, it was, definitely the predominant format, even though records really held their own in the 80s and still had a great value. Cassettes were in vogue mainly because of the Walkman, and that's one of the reasons I really liked it. It's super portable. You take it in the car, but to be able to walk with something, to my knowledge, you couldn't really do on a mass level with the 8-track, but the tape was portable and you could take it, and that Walkman was a game changer. I mean, it was, and then toys were made around it. It was the Teddy Ruxpin, the talking bear with the cassette tape in it, all these talking story books, the Talk Boy from Home Alone. It become a part of culture, and it really started to take over. But in the early 90s, in my area, because I think it was just easier to get tape steel, and tape steel there were so many made, and they were still predominant, and it was still being made in the industry. I was still big into tapes in the early 90s, but industry-wide, by the early 90s, tapes really started to phase out and get replaced by the CD. And by 2001, like I said, 5% of all music was on cassette. All music sold was on cassette. That's a very small slice of that pie, because in 2001, that's pretty close to what records were doing. Records were able to hang on when cassettes weren't. By the end of 2002, new records weren't being produced by the major labels, and records were still somewhat hanging in there. They're not hanging in there, but they're still being produced. There's a nostalgia factor that I think that wouldn't let them go. That nostalgia factor grew and made them boom. Now, the important thing, and this is what will start us off on the next episode, is the 90s were a big music decade. In 1999, there were $40 billion in music sales. You understand, at the height of records in the 80s, there were $2 billion in record sales in the early 80s. In 99, there were $40 billion in music sales. So the 90s were a big, big music era. So the next episode, we're going to come in, we're going to look at CDs, iTunes, Napster, things of that, and the late 90s music, and touch very briefly on what MTV and things of that nature meant to that. So that covers records, 8-tracks, and tapes, the things I know the least about: records and 8-tracks, and then tapes, one of the things I really love. But episode 2 will come in, and we'll look at the CD and the digital revolution, if we make it to the digital revolution. In that one, we should. But thanks for listening. Be sure to like, subscribe, share. Guys, have a great one.